Over the 50 years or so that our volunteer insurance program has existed, we've seen certain kinds of claims repeatedly, as well as some less common ones. So today I'll describe some of those for you and how they occur and what we can do to prevent them. We okay?
Yeah, I think, William, you might have to share screen real quick. On your, yeah, can you find the share screen button on the Zoom?
Yes. Let's see. And I don't see what looks like the slideshow on any of these options. So is there?
You'd have to pull it up on your computer.
Okay. All right. I can do that.
Awesome. Well, in the meantime, I'll sort of introduce, as a sort of, we have three sections that William will talk about. So we'll talk about most common risks, essentials of a risk management system, and then William's going to talk about when incidents happen, and so what to do about that when you have an incident that happens.
All right.
Perfect.
This is not working, so can we?
Yeah, you want me to share my screen again?
Yes, please. Let's do it that way. And I guess I'll need to tell you when to advance the slide,
totally
but
fine.
that
Let's do
won't be
that.
very.
So keep it easy.
Okay. All right. There are four categories of claims that we see in our volunteer insurance program. And today, as we go through the rest of this session, I want you to think about what your volunteers do. Write down all the scenarios you can think of where a volunteer could be injured, injure someone else, damage someone's property, or commit a dishonest act that hurts the organization. So that in a phrase, that threshold question, what could possibly go wrong? I'm sure most of you are positive people most of the time, but sometimes you have to do some negative thinking in order to keep negative things from happening. So we'll do some negative thinking today. And I'll get it going by giving you some examples of actual claims that we've seen in our program, starting with injuries. Falling is the most common type of accident that causes injury claims. Now, to prevent falls, you have to look at the environment that the volunteer is working in, whether it's an environment that you're very familiar with, or perhaps a remote location that you're not as familiar with where the volunteer has been assigned. And if it's possible for the supervisor to scout those remote locations first, that's ideal. But if that's not possible, then let your volunteers know that you're depending on them to be your eyes and ears at the locations where they're assigned, and report to you any conditions that might cause an injury to them or anyone else. And then designate a person to whom that volunteer is to report, the volunteer supervisor or some other person you designate, so that you have a chain of command for that. All right, what kinds of hazards are we looking for? I'll tell you some of the things that we've seen that have caused claims in our program. Tripping over clutter that's been left on the floor, file drawers left out in a walkway, boxes left where people walk, loose rugs on stairways, all those kinds of room. Now, as you think about the tech, even occasionally, and if they are working at it, then make sure it's available when it is needed. Do volunteers or anyone else have to carry things up or downstairs? Make sure that one hand is free for the handrail. Now that means taking smaller loads than they might otherwise take, but it can prevent a fall. Now this might seem like common sense. I'm just telling you what we've actually seen that have resulted in claims in our program. So you can't always take common sense for granted. And these injuries can be very expensive by the time you look at an ambulance trip, medical treatment, all the follow-up visits, prescriptions, physical therapy, and all the rest. It can easily get into many thousands of dollars. So let's look at some other kinds of injuries besides falls. Do your volunteers have to move things, heavy objects? What's the big what's the real world risk there? A back injury. So volunteers who are be involved in those activities need to be trained on the proper way to lift. You know how to do it, right? You lift with your legs, not with your back. A volunteer was hauling furniture in a pickup truck, and the truck was full. There was not a cubic inch of space left, and he had tied it all in there with ropes. And when he got to the destination and tried to take the first piece out of the truck, the whole load shifted and knocked him out, knocked him onto the ground. He broke his leg. So think about how that could have been prevented. You know, smaller loads, more trips, maybe some training with the use of ropes for this particular volunteer. Here's an animating truth about risk management. Always look for the simplest, most practical solution to any hazard that you identify. That's usually going to be the best one. Risk management has no magic to it. There's some assembly required, but no magic. Hand trucks, dollies, other materials handling equipment might be called for. So as you think about what the volunteer does and the risk of an injury, just think of practical ways that you can make that job easier and safer and prevent those injuries. If volunteers use tools in their work, have them show you and not just tell you that they know how to use those tools safely. One volunteer was pulling a nail out of a board, and it might have been for the very first time, because instead of using that claw hammer to pry the nail out, she tried to pull it straight out, straight toward her face. And yes, the hammer slipped, and there was a lot of expensive dental work that resulted. But that was the supervisor's fault, because if the supervisor had taken just a minute to say, okay, we're going to be pulling some nails, show me how you do that, seeing that she didn't know how, give a minute or two of training, that could have prevented that injury. It's a good idea to have veteran volunteers train new ones for two reasons. One, the new volunteer gets the information and the training they need, but two, it reinforces the knowledge of the veteran volunteer. Also makes them feel good about being able to pass along their knowledge to someone else. So it's good for both. We see claims resulting from volunteers working outdoors. It could be landscaping, home repairs. Maybe some of you are involved in activities like that. Many times those accidents can be prevented in a very simple way too. Long sleeves, the right kind of shoes, masks in some cases, leather gloves. We could have had a lot of claims for hand injuries prevented if volunteers had only been wearing leather gloves. You don't have to provide them. You just tell them they'll need them. And if they're invested in your organization, they'll be happy to do that, and they can bring their own. We see claims for allergic reactions to bee stings, poison ivy, pollen, things like this. It's a good idea when you're assigning volunteers and onboarding, anytime in the onboarding process, to check for allergies or other medical conditions that might limit a volunteer's ability to do some of the things you have in mind. It's okay to ask about allergies and medical conditions. Sometimes people say, well, is that a HIPAA risk or possible violation? No, it is not. You're doing this to keep your organization and your volunteers safe. So you can ask about allergies and medical conditions, any physical limitation that might limit their ability to carry out a task safely. I'll pause for a second. Do we have any questions about injuries that we've talked about? Falls, back injuries, things like this. If you don't have questions now, but think of them later, we'll have some time at the end.
Yeah, put it in, if you have questions, please put it in chat. And then, we can always circle back.
All right, and take time to watch your volunteers in action and correct them if they're doing something that's unsafe. Just let them know you want everyone to work as safely as possible for their benefit and for the organization. If you say it with an attitude like that of helpfulness, they'll understand and appreciate it and be more aware of hazards. Safety training is like any other. You have to give the information in the way that it's going to be best received. People sometimes forget what you say, but they always remember how you made them feel when you said it. All right. Are we doing some negative thinking yet as we think about injuries? All right, let's move on then. I can't advance the slide. Move on one more to liability. Go back one. There we go. The second one. This is the L word. Every time I attend a conference, give a presentation, I get questions about liability. We'd like to do this or that activity, but we're concerned about what the liability might be. Fear of the unknown is understandable, but the good news is liability almost always can be managed. So let's talk about that. You can keep the L word in its place. What does that word actually mean? Liability is a situation in which the volunteer and/or the organization is held responsible for bodily injury or property damage. There are some other kinds of liability, but we'll stick to bodily injury and property damage for this session. If there's a lawsuit, it will say that your volunteer was negligent or that your organization was negligent. Now, here's a working definition of negligence that you could write down. It means you did something that you should have known not to do, or you failed to do something that you should have known to do. That's really the essence of negligence. So if you did not properly screen, train, and supervise a volunteer and an injury or property damage occurs, that is how liability might extend to your organization. And we'll talk a little bit about training and supervising later. Now, the charges might not be valid. People get sued all the time for things they did not do. But you want to make an environment that's as conducive to safety, where the chances of a liability claim are as low as you can possibly make them. Sometimes claims in our insurance program arise out of programs that help vulnerable people, elderly, or those with chronic illnesses or disabilities. So I'm sure some of you serve those kinds of clients. It's good risk management to perform background checks on any volunteer who would be working with vulnerable clients. And I know you do that probably. Sterling Volunteers is a partner of ours and a good source for background checks. And they're good background checks, but they're not enough, because you might have a volunteer who's never been arrested or investigated for anything, but still might be able to injure a client. There might be a verbal assault if the volunteer loses his or her temper, or it could even be a physical assault. Unfortunately, we have had some claims in which volunteers struck the people in their care when they lost control. So you have to have rules on what volunteers can and cannot do, and communicate those rules and enforce them. Don't think about empowering volunteers to make their own decisions in this area. It just doesn't work for risk management. Scrub that word from your vocabulary, because if they don't have guidance from you, they might react the same as they would with their own family members, and that might or might not be appropriate. So, for example, we suggest you have written procedures for how volunteers should defuse a situation in which a volunteer or a client, rather, in their care loses their temper, becomes verbally abusive to the volunteer. Might not happen often, but it's best to have that volunteer mentally prepared for that kind of situation, just like you want them mentally prepared for hazards that could cause an injury, like we talked about. Here's another type of liability claim we had, and this underscores the importance of good communication. A volunteer was pushing a fellow in a wheelchair. If we had been watching, I think we all would have agreed that the volunteer was doing a fine job. The wheelchair was going at a safe speed, but the man in the chair didn't think so. He became fearful. He put his feet out to try to stop it, and he was thrown out of the chair and injured. So how do you prevent a situation like that? You know, if the volunteer had said, okay, let's go now. Is this okay? Is this speed all right with you? That could have been prevented. So in your volunteer training, make sure you emphasize the importance of good communication with the client. Bodily injury also includes sexual abuse and molestation. That has to be a concern with any organization working with vulnerable populations. Now, as I said before, sometimes accusations are false, but even if you're blameless, you still have to defend yourself. That can be very expensive, both financially and in terms of your reputation. So, and plus the distraction that is caused. So, do what you can to reduce the risk that an incident will occur, or a volunteer is in a position where they could be falsely accused. Yes, require background checks for any volunteers working with vulnerable individuals, and have written procedures and take the time to explain them. That helps you in two important ways. One, you can make sure that volunteers are performing their work in a standard way that you have approved. And two, you'll discourage any people who might have bad intent and want to volunteer for your organization. The more obstacles you put in front of those people, the more likely it is they'll turn around and walk away. In the last part of the session, we're going to get into how you decide the procedures that are right for you. There is a method that works, but do we have any questions as of now about liability?
Yeah, there was a question that came in from Asma that asked, even if we, the organization, preemptively ask and follow these instructions and an injury still occurs, are we still liable?
If you follow these procedures that you have carefully thought out, this is doing your due diligence. The more your procedures are well thought out, and the more assiduously you follow them, the less likely it is that a liability claim will be successful. Remember that definition of negligence. If you did everything that you should have known to do and you didn't do anything you should have known not to do, it's going to be very difficult to lodge a successful lawsuit against you, because liability means you did something wrong or something negligent. It doesn't mean that just because something bad happens, it comes back on the organization. That's what risk management is all about.
And then I'm sure this is a question you get all the time, William. Valerie asks, does a liability waiver really protect us, the organization?
Not completely, to the point where you would rely on it. And I think, Gung, you're going to have more to say about that at the end.
I can share my thoughts, but I think, you
want to go ahead and do it now while we're at it?
Sure. I mean, we can, we could talk. Yeah, certainly. Let's, love to get your perspective, and I can chime in a little too.
There's nothing wrong with having a waiver that a volunteer signs, a waiver of liability, but its highest value is simply in focusing the volunteer's attention on the fact that bad things can happen. that there are hazards involved. The limitation from our point of view is that many times a judge has struck down a waiver of liability saying, this is construed too much in favor of the organization. It's not fair to the volunteer, and I'm going to let that volunteer's lawsuit proceed. So it has limited value in our opinion and should not be relied upon as an absolute shield against liability.
Right. I share a very similar perspective to William, which is it's you know, a lot of what William just talked about is communicating to the volunteer the risk of that they might have in this role. And so a waiver is in many ways a way for you to communicate those risks, right? If someone did sign a waiver, it does say like, hey, we did share our these risks. We talked about it. Here's what that looks like. I think for me, separately, it is a little bit of a, but that said, if you do something negligent, like William said, it doesn't necessarily protect you from that action. But it is, I think, a way to indicate that, you have done your part of your duty of sharing these risks. I think the other thing for me oftentimes, right, is, even though perhaps a judge may not accept a waiver, et cetera, it is a first line of defense in some respects, right, for an organization to say, hey, you can always remind the volunteer that they did sign a waiver, and that at times may be sufficient, right, for that individual. So yeah, I think everything William says is definitely on point there.
Other liability questions before we move on to auto liability? Okay. Next slide, please. I imagine some of you have volunteers who drive their own vehicles as part of their assignments, taking clients for appointments or visitation, or wherever they might want to go, or just taking supplies perhaps from point B back to point A. From the claims we see in our program, accidents at intersections are the most common kind of accident that occurs. Left turns when you don't have the right of way, turning from the wrong lane, running through stop lights or stop signs, those kinds of things. Sometimes those accidents are very serious. One of our volunteers turned left in front of a delivery truck. She was killed. The occupants of the truck were injured. So there have been other very serious accidents from time to time. So how do you prevent that? Well, due diligence would include getting motor vehicle records on all of your volunteers who will be driving on your behalf to make sure that they haven't had serious violations. One reason we recommend Sterling volunteers is that their records are updated in real time. So if a volunteer gets a DUI on the weekend, you'll know about it Monday. You don't have to wait for a year to get another motor vehicle record. The same as with background checks, getting those MVRs can help if your organization is sued, because it demonstrates that you have done your due diligence and can help protect you against a charge of negligence, therefore reducing liability. Where vehicle safety inspections are required, put each volunteer's vehicle inspection date on your calendar, and every year ask them for that certificate that shows that their vehicle passed inspection. If you didn't do that, and the brakes were to fail on the volunteer's vehicle and an injury occurred, that could expose you to liability. Sorry. Vehicle-related accidents don't always occur in traffic, by the way. There was a fatality where the volunteer was getting ready to transport a client somewhere, didn't realize that the client was standing behind the vehicle when she backed up. In another case, a volunteer had the car running, the engine running. It was in gear. She reached over to open the passenger side door for the client. Her foot slipped off the brake. The car lurched forward, knocking the volunteer or the client down. So how could these things have been prevented? Again, I said it's the most simple solution that usually is best. If there were a rule that the volunteer cannot start that vehicle until the client, whoever they're transporting, is in there and safely buckled in, neither of those accidents would have occurred. You might put some of these into a training program that you have, some of these requirements, and have the volunteer pass a written test before being allowed to drive on your behalf. Again, you're doing your due diligence. As with so many of the risks we're talking about today, it's all about awareness and communication. I mentioned, I don't think I did mention, we have a resource called Preventer Papers. If you're a member of VIS, these are resources that are available to you. There you go. Available to you on our website 24/7. And we have 24 of these 1- and 2-page documents that are all about vehicle safety. So you can avail yourself of those. They're good for small group training, or if that's not possible, you can just give them to individual volunteers. We also, a few years ago, developed an online vehicle safety training program just for volunteers. We did this with the National Volunteer Transportation Center. If you have a volunteer driver take this online course straight through, it takes about an hour. Each section is followed by multiple choice questions that they have to answer before they move on to the next section. It's for those of you who have been through a driver's education program, it's like that, except it's more about volunteer responsibilities, including the communication component with clients. Okay, let's move on to the slide that highlights employee dishonesty. What access do your volunteers, or your staff for that matter, have to bank information, other sensitive data that might present an opportunity to embezzle funds? It happens sometimes. It's always someone who was very trusted who's the culprit. If you want to read about the most spectacular embezzlement scheme that I've ever heard of, go online and search for embezzlement Dixon, Illinois. It'll curl your hair to read about what this lady was able to get away with. We won't get into that in detail in terms of prevention, but we do have some resources on that in our on our website for our members. All right, now before we get into how to develop a system to manage all this and put it all together, any questions about what we've covered so far? All right. Okay, let's go. Let's talk about how to put it all together in a system. There we go. The threshold question is what could possibly go wrong? We've done a little risk identification today as we've reviewed various injury and liability scenarios. That's the first step. What comes next is deciding what risks you should worry about the most and which ones you can accept. Then you determine how you can reduce or eliminate the most serious risks. Insurance is for the serious ones you cannot eliminate entirely. And then decide how you'll respond if an incident does occur. Make risk management a guiding principle of your selection, orientation, and training efforts. Hold people accountable for following your procedures. And then if something bad does happen, what can you learn from it? So let's break all this down, starting with risk identification. After you've thought about all the fall hazards, the back injuries, working with vulnerable people, some of the other risks that we've talked about, dig deeper. get your best people together, and think about what could possibly happen. Your best people might include someone from another organization that's already been through this, or maybe a DOVIA group for volunteer managers, or some LinkedIn group, perhaps, people who already have worked it through and can help you. What could possibly go wrong? Utilities and mass transit companies have been working on the answer to that question for many years, but you can always learn more. After Hurricane Sandy a few years ago, new chapters got added to their What Could Possibly Go Wrong books. When Atlanta got gridlocked a few years ago by an ice storm, same thing. Disaster plans were modified to address what had been learned. I think one chapter is let's don't have everyone go home at one time. But those are maybe foreseeable, but when you really dig deep, you can find some things that no one would ever think of. At a state prison in Dannemora, New York, a few years ago, the chapters that were added to their disaster plans were let's lock up our tools so a staff member who's steal a saw escape the prison. Pretty unthinkable stuff. But everybody has unthinkable stuff. And that's what you get to if you really dig deep and into that question, what could possibly go wrong? We talked about screening volunteers and training them to prevent a possible assault on someone in their care. Turn it around. What if someone in their care were to assault them? Would that be possible in your world? Or could that volunteer be assaulted by a client's dog or a client's nephew? Would that be a real world risk scenario by you? Do your clients ever ask volunteers to do unexpected tasks? Let's say that you have a volunteer whose responsibility is transportation. They're going to take clients where they need to go. But then the client, after a little trust has been developed, the client says, "Oh, can you come in and help me get my grandmother's vase off of the high shelf? I can't reach it." Or, "Can you help me move a heavy desk from the attic down to the basement?" Or take some bags of mulch out to the garden for me. Now, there's a risk exposure in each of those three requests that has not been contemplated by the volunteer or the volunteer supervisor. So, you could have a back injury. The volunteer could drop that vase and break it. They could fall off the ladder and, hurt themselves 1,000 ways. If they've been in the client's house, they might be accused of stealing something later. So you don't want those things to happen. So how do you prevent something like that? Well, the first thing to do is not to agree on anything until the volunteer has discussed it with his or her supervisor. They're nice people. They want to be accommodating. They want to help out, but you got to put the brakes on a little bit in situations like this. So the volunteer supervisor then would call the client and say, "I understand you asked William to do this or that. Is that true?" And because sometimes there's a miscommunication. So if everyone understands what the request is, then you decide, is the volunteer willing and able to carry it out? If so, fine. If not, then the request can either be denied, or if you have good collaborative relationships with other organizations, or maybe a peripheral group of volunteers for certain requests, you would be able to accommodate what the client wants. One of our insured organizations developed a relationship with a local college football coach. And the football coach said, some of you guys, we might call on you from time to time to go lift a heavy object for someone in the community. They were happy to do it. The job got done. Just a good example of collaboration. Sometimes the area agencies on aging would be able to refer you to another organization where these kinds of capabilities exist if you don't have them. But the main point is, don't agree to anything until you know that it's safe to proceed. Now, this might seem like a little bit of overkill for communication, but let's say the scenario is the volunteer who's been driving this client is willing to go move those bags of mulch on Saturday and help the client out. Once the job is done, tell the volunteer to call the supervisor, even if it's just to leave a voice message. And not only, and to say that the job has been done and the volunteer is leaving. Not just that, but have the client speak on the voice message too, saying, yes, thank you so much. The job is done. The volunteer is leaving. Thank you. Because if the volunteer later is accused of something and you have that voice message saying, with the client's voice saying everything is fine, that's going to help you if the volunteer is accused later of something that they didn't do. So that it's hard to over communicate in volunteer management. Some other scenarios. What if a volunteer unintentionally violated IRS rules regarding nonprofit political activity? That's an easy mistake to make. It could jeopardize your tax-exempt status. You can learn more at irs.gov in their series, in their section on nonprofits. But these are just another example of what you might find as a risk if you really dig deep. Whatever you, I think as you were coming into the room, you were asked to think of what a screaming disaster would be for your organization. I hope some of you wrote those down, and I'm not asking you what they are, but what you think about what you wrote down and ask yourself, would this be something that you would be comfortable discussing with your team? If so, then you're on the right track. But if not, then this is a problem, because if there can't be any taboos in risk management. If you can't discuss it, you can't manage it. So if it's something perhaps involving elder abuse or some other criminal activity, try to get rid of those taboos and make sure that you have an open and honest discussion about, yes, this could happen. What if it's a board member who's involved? You know, how would you handle it? The up in State College, Pennsylvania, a few years ago, a longstanding nonprofit serving kids at risk went out of existence because that question had not been asked. You might remember that one. Okay, let's move on to eliminating.
And William, right before you you move on, there was Valerie had another question around often we have community partners that provide meals for volunteers. Are there any risks involved with this? Like,
These are meals for the volunteers?
it looks like yes, for the volunteers.
Food safety comes to mind. Beyond that, I'm not able to think of an immediate risk. This is something that's done with care and, again, due diligence. Did I understand the question correctly?
Yeah, no, you did. You did. It was for the volunteers, so you know.
Okay. Sometimes there's one good thing, talking insurance for a minute, it's a good idea for those two organizations that are involved. They both have general liability policies, I'm sure. Because they have this relationship, it's a good idea for each of them to name the other as an additional insured on their policies. This is strictly routine, protects both organizations. If you have questions about that, your insurance agent can explain to you and can get it done for you. Additional insured. All right. Now, once you've identified your risks, go to the next step here. What can you do to eliminate or reduce them? Here's we talked about the volunteer who's asked to do something at the client's home. And I talked about the process of getting that vetted with the supervisor and the client, and then closing the communication loop by having that phone call or that phone message in which the volunteer says, I've done it, I'm leaving, and the client says, I'm satisfied, I'm happy. That's a good example of following the chain of command and having good communication throughout. You can use an approach like that to apply risk management to virtually any scenario that you can imagine. As you think about what could go wrong, you're taking time to evaluate the risk. If there is one, you're making sure the communication is clear, task is done, volunteer is safe, client is satisfied. I mentioned the extending your capabilities by bringing in other organizations that might have volunteers who are better equipped to do what's been requested. Your managing risks in this area might include some training on those IRS rules about political advocacy. There might be a local attorney who can go over that with you. It could include training in vehicle safety, where handling your money is involved, some training on separation of duties. You don't have this, and depositing those checks or paying invoices. You have to both for taking money in and depositing money. Now, my association has a variety of resources to help you with that. Also, everyone has a general liability policy in this webinar. Your insurance company has a loss control department. Put them to work. They might have some resources that are valuable to you. All right, risk transfer. That simply means you buy insurance for the serious risk that you can't eliminate entirely. Our organization specializes in insurance that's designed specifically for volunteers in case they're injured or they accidentally injure someone else or have a vehicle accident. All right, let's talk about selection, orientation, and training. Should be the next slide. I know many of you have outstanding programs for that already, and there's a lot of good information out there from a number of consultants in the field. Make your volunteer application form work to your advantage in selecting and assigning volunteers. Use it to describe available assignments, ask about their areas of interest, ask about their special skills, medical conditions, anything that could affect how you assign them. Background checks. Be careful with that. The Fair Credit Reporting Act requires that you have to have a specific reason if you're going to, for example, get a credit report on a volunteer. You can't just pull a credit report on all of them. It has to be related to what their duties will be. Orientation. Does the volunteer know who to report to? If they need something or have a complaint or problem, take the time to go over your safety rules that go with that assignment, record keeping, all the rest. Have your veteran volunteers train new ones, as I suggested. Now, real quickly, hold volunteers accountable. Next slide. The late, great Susan Ellis, some of you might be familiar with, she started the Energize Publishing Company. She always said there's the fewer distinctions you can make between volunteers and staff, the better. So just as you hold your paid staff accountable, do the same for volunteers. Make sure that they follow your procedures and don't, as I said before, don't empower them. And if they consistently refuse to follow your procedures or want to do it their own way, there might come a time when you just tell them you think their light could shine a little brighter somewhere else. And that's okay, because as long as you put your organization's interests first, you'll be fine. All right, and the last item here, when something bad happens, have formal procedures for responding to an incident. If the volunteer is injured, injures someone else, damages someone's property, this is part of the process of when you are identifying your risk by digging deep to think of all the things that could possibly go wrong. Build into that who would do what when it does occur. Have your volunteer report it immediately to the volunteer supervisor. Don't go to the police or some government agency, as long as that is consistent with your mandated reporting responsibilities. Take it off of the volunteer and have the volunteer supervisor handle it. This makes sure that the chain of command is involved. You don't want your executive director not knowing about something bad that's happened, perhaps something that could lead to a liability claim. And by the way, liability claims are very slow to develop most times. When you do get those lawsuit papers, sometimes it can be traced back to something that happened 6 months earlier. And if anyone said, well, let's see if it blows over, or let's ask our attorney whether we should report the claim. No, that's inviting disaster. Report it to your insurance company right away, because they have a word that they use, timely. If your claim is not timely, they will deny that claim. And don't be in a position of arguing with your insurance company about timely. Put them on notice. If the claim turns out to be nothing, fine. But if it into a claim later on, you've done your duty. Initial response to the incident, what can you learn from it? You know, every organization can do a lessons learned session, if you will. Were your procedures being followed? If not, why not? Is there something you need to add to your procedures or something to change so that it doesn't happen again? All part of due diligence. Okay, I did not describe, you can go to the last slide there of mine.
Yep.
I didn't describe our insurance program, but my contact information will be on here and our website. So if you're interested in insurance, specifically volunteers, for volunteers, you can get it there. But I'll take any questions before I turn it over to Gong for the last part.
Yeah, let's see or perhaps we'll give folks a moment to share any questions here. And we put, Ariana has put William's email and LinkedIn here for you all as well. So as you think of questions, please still post. Just to wrap up for us today. So for anyone that doesn't know about Civic Champs, we're a volunteer management software company, and which is why we got connected with William. We were both speaking at a conference together. So we help people with recruiting, onboarding, scheduling, engaging, and reporting. The most relevant pieces perhaps are, we have the ability to help people check in and out. And then also, of course, we collect waivers from folks if they need to do waivers, whether at check-in, at sign-up, et cetera, just as a way to, again, to communicate to folks that there are risks, right? And so if you're interested, please feel free to reach out to us. And then real quickly, here is just our contact information for William and I. And so you can see this. We'll share all the slides with you all, of course, along with our contact information. And then finally, we're going to share just a little bit of a feedback form here. If you don't mind sharing your feedback, we're always looking to get better with our webinars. So any of your thoughts is definitely appreciated. And then finally, William, do you want to talk about some freebies that we got lined up for folks?
Yes, these are some that you can have. They're part of what we call the Viz Vault on our website. This is the members only section where we've compiled risk management resources. We have about close to 100 documents that are all about how to prevent bad things from happening. There's a little bit about insurance. A lot of nonprofit organizations say, well, my insurance agent said, well, I'm the first nonprofit he's had. Well, this is just a little guidance on the insurance basics, nice to have and need to have coverage. The checklist for the most common risks that we see could be a good starting point for if you go about developing a formal risk management system. And the risk management policy is something that you might want to play up not only within your organization, but also to your supporters and your clients. This shows that you are taking a formal approach to this very important process of risk management. But there are many other resources, the preventer papers that I mentioned about vehicle safety and injury prevention, and a lot of other things that we make available to members.
Awesome. Thank you so much, William. We're here at the hour, so we'll wrap things up. Thanks everyone for joining today. We'll keep you all posted about our next webinar that's coming up. And yeah, thank you so much, William, for joining us. Your insights were phenomenal, and hopefully folks have some good takeaways from today. So
thanks everyone for taking time to be with us.